Hello everyone, tonight let's go back in time, but not to castles, nor to wars. Today, we walk through narrow alleys, among hanging clothes and thick silences. It's night, there's a strange smell in the air, something between smoke and vinegar. The windows are half open, like suspicious eyes. We're in some random village in Europe, a distant century, fear close at hand, because this is the time when life suddenly stopped. Without warning, without explanation, it was the time of the Great Plagues. And when we say plagues, we're not talking about abstract concepts. We're talking about hunger, fever, children who were too quiet, mothers who stopped singing, priests who stopped playing. This video isn't about numbers. It's about people, about what really happens to ordinary people when the world falls apart. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And if you can, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is now where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan to create that soft background hum. And let's begin tonight's journey together. It was on a sultry morning, when the fog still clung to the rooftops, that the first funeral bell rang. Nobody ran. They just listened. The bell was no longer an announcement, but a warning. That sound didn't ask for attention. It warned that it was better not to leave the house. The smell of burnt porridge escaped from the chimneys, as if mothers were cooking with their eyes closed, not out of laziness, but out of fear of seeing. And the broth, previously seasoned with fresh herbs and care, was now just hot water with a piece of stale bread. The children chewed slowly, without asking questions. Eating stopped being a pleasure and became silence. In the tavern in the center, the windows were open, but no music could be heard. Nobody sang. The drums that once accompanied laughter were stored away. The last song had been sung days before by a man too drunk to realize it was too late. Since then, glasses were served with trembling hands and loud eyes. Even drunks have learned to whisper. It was as if any loud sound would attract the attention of something that was prowling around the village. The absence of music was not immediately noticed, but when it was realized, no one wanted to be the first to try to bring her back. The children who once ran through the gardens and threw stones into the river now walked like shadows. They played in silence. They invented silent games, where the look was worth more than the word. Someone once burst out laughing and was rebuked, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear there was a visitor that no one invited, but that everyone welcomed with reverence. Mothers no longer told bedtime stories. They just stroked their children's hair, hoping that sleep would come quickly and quietly. There was hope, but it also whispered. It was a timid hope, almost ashamed to exist in that scenario. It lived deep in a trunk, along with the old letters and faded ribbons. It was small, but not non-existent. On some nights, when the sky opened up clear, a few candles were lit not out of necessity, but as a ritual, as if the light could convince time that there was still life there. But even those candles were discreet. No more loud prayers were heard, nor loud crying, only teary eyes and silent hands clasped. They say that the sound of the plague is not a scream. It is not a cough or a lament. The sound of the plague is absence. It is the space between words. It is the echo of a laugh that does not come. It is the noise that did not happen. The absence of the guitar on the corner. The silent drum. The bell that rings alone. It is the sound of the spoon on the empty plate. And it is this silence that remains even after the bodies leave. Because the body goes, but its emptiness weighs on the rooms. And when night falls, as it does now, this story whispers across the rooftops of villages that no one visits. Maybe there is still a soul there, sweeping the ground out of habit. Or maybe it is just the wind, trying to remember the sound of forgotten song. But even if no one sings anymore, the memory of the song still sleeps under the tiles. And if you listen carefully, with a calm heart and your eyes closed, you might hear a timid chord in the depths of the breeze. Because some songs never die. They just wait in silence. The clothes were always damp. Not because it rained all the time, but because fear prevented them from being washed like before. It was common to see them hanging above fireplaces, absorbing the smoke, gradually darkening, hardening in the folds. The windows remained closed, and the sun that could dry them was treated as an intruder. Outside, the air carried rumors, and no one wanted to risk the wind bringing the disease as well. It was safer to trust the smoke, a dense smoke which permeated everything and made the eyes burn. And yet, she was the one who brought comfort. A mother hung a woolen cloak near the embers. She didn't look at the fabric, but she heard its slow crackling, as if the cloth was breathing too. And maybe I would actually breathe, because at that time, wool seemed to have a soul. The smells invaded the houses even before the visitors arrived. It wasn't perfume, nor the aroma of food. It was vinegar. It was garlic. Dried herbs hung on doors, eaves, cribs. Vinegar was spread across the walls as if it were paint. Every corner of the house had its invisible guardian. There was a corner where a beam of light illuminated a clump of leaves. Grandma said that it warded off evil, and evil, at that time, had no face, just symptoms, just rumors, and that's why we fought with what we had. The odor of these home remedies mixed with that of the body that avoided bathing. And so the entire village was a quilt of pungent smells, each house its own unique blend of protectiveness and despair. The act of washing clothes, which was once almost a celebration of light, has become dangerous. Going to the river meant exposing yourself. Carrying wet cloths through the alleys was a risk that few wanted to take. They said that water carried and brought what the eyes could not see. So, it was better to keep the dirt that was already known. Mothers, who once took pride in keeping their sheets white, now hid them away. Visible dirt seemed less threatening than the invisible dirt that could come with cleaning. Homemade soap, made with fat and ash, dried on the shelves, forgotten. The water, which had previously run freely down the stone stairs, now flowed cautious. Washing became a rare, almost forbidden ritual, and so the clothes carried days, weeks of history embedded in them. Today, a hot bath is so simple that we almost forget its power. A turn of the valve, and the water falls like controlled rain. But there was a time when such luxury was unthinkable. The heat of the water at that time came from the same fire that cooked fear. It was necessary to ration firewood, and even when I did, the shower was quick. A bucket, a damp cloth, and the desire not to take off all your clothes, because the cold was also an enemy, and the body, unaccustomed to showing itself, hid more than just skin. Taking a bath was like being reborn for minutes, and then put on the same cloth again, still damp, still smelling of home, of the fireplace, of garlic and smoke. A cycle of garments that were never really clean, but that served as a shield against fear. The wet wool, in particular, seemed to have a mind of its own. It took days to dry, right next to the fire, and when it finally lost the moisture, it never lost the weight, a weight that went beyond the fabric. It was as if she carried the sleepless nights, the whispers at the foot of the stairs, the muffled cries into the pillow in the corner. Some mornings, a mother would get up early and clutch that cloak with both hands. She knew she wasn't just dealing with cloth. It was skin, a living skin that forgot to die. Because in that village, even the fabrics breathed, and each fold held a sigh, a promise, a longing. That's what you wore every day. As I walked through the streets, every person was a mixture of ancient smells. There was no fragrance, there was history. The perfume was one of survival. A little vinegar behind the ear, garlic in the shirt pocket, a dried lavender sprig tied around the wrist. Clothing was not just protection against the cold, it was a magical shield, built with memories. Some days, at bedtime, a child would smell his own mango before going to sleep. That brought comfort, because the familiar scent was all that was predictable left. And maybe it was also all that was left of love, a silent love, with the scent of smoke and hope. And now, when you turn on the shower and feel the steam rise, perhaps you realize that there is something sacred in this gesture. The hot water running down your shoulders carries more than dirt. It washes away the fears of the day. Be thankful for this shower that doesn't need firewood, and for these clothes that dry in the wind, without secret, because in times not so distant, clothes spoke. And they said with their smells everything that no one dared to say out loud. Perhaps in silence, they still say it. Just close your eyes and feel it. And when night fell on those clothes that never dried, a new kind of silence took over the village. It was a silence that did not come from inside the houses, but from the walls that protected. The walls, made of ancient stones, began to move, not in the literal sense, but in its way of existing. They creaked, they crackled, as if they were keeping a secret too old to be told during the day. It was at these times that the residents realized that the village was not sleeping. She just changed shape, and the walls became the voices of the night. Voices of stone, heavy, with an accent of time and mass. The stones that formed the walls were always there, but they were never heard as much as during those months. When the world outside seemed about to collapse, they became the last guardians, and they spoke, with small pops, with dull groans, with slow beats that seemed to come from the ground. Sometimes someone would wake up in the middle of the night and swear they heard footsteps, but it was just the stones, or maybe not even that. Maybe it was the souvenirs brushing against the cracks of history. And at the foot of the wall, some children pressed their ears together, trying to hear something that would give meaning to their fear. They only found textured silence. Rodents lived in the cracks between the walls. They were small, fast, and alert. They knew everything before anyone else. When danger approached, they disappeared, and their absence was more frightening than their presence. They crossed roofs, kitchens, and chimneys. They were the first to smell what was coming. And at night, their tiny footsteps joined the sound of the stones, creating a symphony of unrest. It was possible to imagine that the village had become a living organism, where every wall breathed, every shadow watched, and the rats were their messengers. Some people said you could hear the plague, not as a voice, but as a sound. A faint, constant noise that mingled with the creaking of wood and the tinkling of well chains. It was a sound that seemed to anticipate tragedy. Before anyone got sick, he would come. It was like a wordless announcement, a lament without an owner, and when the sound stopped, the body fell. Therefore, sleeping became an act of courage. Closing my eyes was like signing a contract without reading the fine print, because the danger could be in the next hit of the wall, or in the silence after it. Today, sleeping seems simple, a common, automatic gesture. But back then, sleep was fought over. It came slowly, suspiciously. And when it did come, it was light, interrupted, full of shocks. Sleeping without fear was a privilege reserved for a few. The most tired, those who had already lost too much, those who had nothing more to fear. For the rest, there was the ritual of going to bed, a lit candle, a heavy blanket, a whispered prayer, and the wish that night, the walls would remain silent, that the stone would not speak, that the silence would not respond. It was said that the plague whispered between the cracks, that she didn't need to scream. A breath was enough. A whisper carried on the wind, a slight shiver down my spine. Sometimes it was the sound of something falling, others of something breathing where it shouldn't. But what was most frightening was the sound that didn't come. The total absence, the vacuum, as if the world held its breath. And it was in this vacuum that the true terror lurked. Because when even the mice fell silent, even the stones stopped creaking, it was a sign that something had already happened. And so, night after night, the village remained standing, surrounded by walls that said little, but said enough. Stone murmurs that held ancient secret. Today, these sounds no longer exist. But maybe if you're in a really old place, next to a stone wall, and the wind is right, maybe you hear it, not a scream, but an ancestral sigh. And in that sigh, perhaps there still lives the echo of a village that survived the longest night of all. And it was after so many nights of the walls whispering their stone warnings that something even deeper began to change. Not in the houses, not in clothes, but in the rituals that gave meaning to living and dying. It was in the eyes of the priestess that this was seen first. A look that once conveyed firmness and now hesitated. A step that was once decisive now avoided proximity. Faith, which has always lived in gestures, had to learn to exist without touch. And so, the foreheads no longer received the blessing. The hand that had previously made the sign of the cross now hovered in the air, not daring to come down. Silence reached the altar. The last rites began to take place remotely. The priest stood at the door of the house, and the family stood on the threshold. Words spoken between spaces. Prayers that needed to be shouted without raising one's voice. The cross raised in the air, like a symbolic shield. And in the heart of each one, the hope that faith, even without contact, still had strength. Inside the church, empty pews added to the echo. The sound of his own voice sounded strange to his ears. And even there, within the most sacred walls, fear sat in the corners, invisible but present. There was a day when an old priest tried to bless a sick child. He approached, knelt down, and extended his hand. But at the last moment, he picked it up. He looked up at the sky as if apologizing, and he drew the cross in the void. The mother cried silently, but she understood. Because touch, at that time, was more than a gesture. It was risky, and not just physical. It was also the risk of discrediting, of losing trust in what is sacred. Faith without touch seemed less real, but that was all that was left. And because of that, it was done with even more intensity. Religious symbols began to be viewed with caution. The rosary was only played by the person who wore it. The images of saints were covered with cloths. The holy water evaporated without use. And yet, everyone still prayed. Because spirituality is not extinguished by distance. She just changes shape. And it was at that time that many understood that faith is not in the visible gesture, but in the felt gesture. A calm thought, a sigh of surrender, a candle on the edge of the bed. That was all that was left. And for many, that was enough. Rituals needed to be reinvented. Some were made by children on behalf of their parents. Others took place outdoors, under the moon. There was no longer the comfort of words whispered in it. Now it was the wind that carried the prayers, and each person became a little priest of himself. Spirituality descended from the altars and spread through the corridors of homes. And perhaps it was at this time that it was discovered that faith can also live in absence. In the empty space where there had once been a gesture, there was now intention, and that was also prayer. The absence of touch became a sentence, not just physical, but emotional. The hand that no longer touched foreheads no longer held the other hands either. There were no more kisses on the forehead, hugs after mass, or arms linked in procession. And yet, something remained, a silent, invisible force that ran through the absences, as if the divine had discovered other paths, more subtle, more internal. And the foreheads, even though they were not touched, still bore marks. Marks of faith imprinted not by the priest's hand, but by the resistance of the spirit. Today, when you enter an empty church, perhaps you will feel this. The echo of a faith that had to learn to float between distant bodies, a spirituality that has overcome fear without breaking. Because there are gestures that never disappear, they just become invisible. And in this invisible, the sacred lives. It does not need touch, only intention, and sometimes a calm sigh at the end of a long day, in the shadow of a candle that still insists on burning. After even faith had to learn to survive without touch, life turned to what could still be held with one's hands. And among all the things that were still shared, bread was the most delicate. There was something sacred about the act of cutting bread, but now that gesture was accompanied by a sigh. Because bread could save, or kill. The batches were smaller, the dough fermented in silence, and the smell that once announced abundance now brought tension. Hunger spied at the windows, and superstition spied at the table. Eating is no longer comfort. It became a choice. Risk at every meal. Uncertainty fermented along with the dough. Moldy bread was common. The humidity in the houses, the lack of fresh ingredients, the delay in consumption, everything conspired against her purity. But hunger did not wait. And then you ate it anyway. The dark part was cut off and the edge was smelled. And sometimes everything was risk. Some said the mold caused visions. Others swore that it was not the bread, but fear that made them see things. In any case, what fed also confused. A child said he had been daydreaming. An old man was talking to someone who wasn't. And the bread remained on the table. Moist, innocent, dangerous. There were silent rituals about who should break the bread first. In many homes, the oldest. In others, the strongest. And in some, the unluckiest. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew it. Because the one who broke the bread, by tasting it first, became a kind of sentinel. If nothing happened to him, the others ate. If he coughed, they hesitated. It was a gesture loaded with superstition and caution. And so, many times, people broke it with their eyes closed, as if, by not seeing what they were doing, they could avoid the weight of the gesture. Eating became faith without prayer. Some families tried to protect their bread with hugs, blessings, and crosses made with the tip of a knife. Before each meal, a small gesture of faith. A bay leaf in the oven, a whispered word before the first bite, a star-shaped cut, each in their own way, trying to negotiate with the invisible. There was an ancestral knowledge that was reborn in these practices. Knowledge that came from grandmothers, from healers, from stories told at the bedside. The kitchen became an altar, the table, a temple, and bread, even though fragile, became a symbol of everyday resistance. It's curious to think that today, with shelves full and soft breads available, there is still an anxiety surrounding food. Many look at their plates with suspicion, not because of mold, but because of excess, for the silent doubt that accompanies us at the table. Is that enough? Is it safe? Am I worthy of this support? These questions, even unspoken, hang over many meals, as if something from those ancient villages was still within us, an inherited fear, shaped in silence, fermented over centuries. When in doubt, people ate with their eyes closed, not for pleasure, but for protection, as if they didn't want to see the risk, but also didn't want to reject the chance. Eating became an act of quiet courage, and this habit, subtle and dark, has stood the test of time. Today, perhaps you don't close your eyes when you eat, but perhaps you distract your gaze, divert your attention. The body remembers what the mind has forgotten, because somewhere deep inside, we still know there are days when bread can be a blessing, on other days, a trial, and on all days, it is always a symbol. Maybe now, as you cut your bread, you feel something different, an old respect, a brief silence, not for the food itself, but for the gesture, because there, between your hands, is a memory that is not just yours. It belongs to everyone who once ate it with care, who broke off a small but meaningful piece, and as they chewed, they felt the weight of being alive. In difficult times, that was already a miracle. Sometimes, what cannot be said in life must be delivered in death, and that is how the note sewn into the bellies of the dead came about. No one spoke about it during the day. It was a secret whispered between needles and fine thread. When a body fell silent, someone from the family would approach with trembling hands and a hidden scrap. It was not out of vanity, not a formal rite. It was necessity, a request, an apology, a name. The pain needed to be sent somewhere, and the dead, still immobile, became the messenger, an envelope of flesh sewn with hope. These tickets were not made of paper. Paper was scarce, fragile. Fabric was preferred. A piece of handkerchief, a strip of veil, a fold of Sunday shirt. There, something was being embroidered, sometimes an initial, others a date, in rare cases, whole words, but almost always it was something that only the author understood, because it wasn't about readability, it was about feeling. The cloth absorbed tears. It was folded carefully, placed next to the deceased's belly, and then sewn up silently, without witnesses, as if that were a last secret between two worlds. The families who lost everything had a lot to say, but for no one. Without a temple, without mass, without letters, they were left with this gesture. Sewing became prayer, the needle confession, and the body, now quiet, was the last blank page available. There were those who placed a small object inside the seed. A seed, a button, a strand of hair. What fixed there was not just memory, it was desire. A wish that what was broken in life would be glued together in eternity, and that someone, somewhere, would read it, feel, welcome, even if only in a dream. What the dead carried with them, no one could read, and perhaps it was better that way, because those messages were not for the living. They were letters thrown into the dark, written with fear, love, regret. The cloth absorbed everything, and once sewn, it was never opened, because opening it would be like interrupting a journey, like tearing up a destiny. That is why the bodies were buried with those secrets well kept. And deep down, there was relief in that, knowing that something of us continued on, even after the end, even without an answer. It was a longing written on cloth, not on paper, because the paper tears. The cloth retains the smell. Keep touch, keep time. A note on fabric is more than words. Its body, its tactile memory, and so it made more sense. It was closer to what was wanted to say, when words were no longer enough. And in many homes, to this day, there is a piece of cloth kept in a box. Nobody talks about him, but everyone knows what it is, and whose it is. An unsent ticket, an old pain, a memory that refuses to fade. The strongest image is perhaps this, the skin turning into an envelope. And death, the postman. It is a strange image, perhaps uncomfortable, but deeply human, because when everything is taken from us, we look for ways to continue loving. And loving, in this case, was sewing. It was giving. It was trusting that, even without words, someone somewhere would understand. Maybe not with their eyes, but with their heart, because there are messages that can only be read with the soul. And the dead knew how to carry these with ease. And now, as you take a deep breath and let these images settle in your mind, think of the gestures that still carry hidden meanings today. A carefully made bow, a piece of fabric kept for years, a note that was never delivered. History does not live only in books. It hides in seams, in aromas, in gestures that we repeat without knowing why. And perhaps, when you close your eyes tonight, you too will feel this invisible thread that connects us to those who came before. A thread made of silence, memory, and love. And now that everyone is asleep in the village, even the bells, now that the bread has been broken, the wool has dried as best it could, and the notes lie sewn together in silence, only the echo remains. Not the echo of voices, but of absences, of songs that never came back, of foreheads that weren't touched, of interrupted ritual. Still, there is a deep breath behind all this, because even in times of fear, people continued. They continued cooking, washing, sewing, praying. They continued to love in silence, and hoped that some sound, some smell, some word would connect them to something greater. The plague took a lot, but not everything. Perhaps what remains is precisely what was never said, what was only felt. The memories that don't appear in books, but that still live in the smallest gesture. When you close your eyes and smell the bread, or hear the creak of an old door, when you rest your head on a pillow and the silence around you seems thicker, perhaps in these moments you touch something that comes from far away, something that has crossed generation, and that continues here, sleeping within us. Because in the end, that's what history is made of. Not only of kings and dates, but of clothes hanging in the smoke, of a father who breaks bread in fear, from a grandmother who sews a piece of longing in secret, of a priest who prays without touching, of a child learning to whisper. That's what we're made of. Soft survival, of small gestures that, together, sustained entire centuries. So, if this story touched you, know that there are many others like it. Stories that whisper more than they scream, that don't want to wake you up, but accompany you to sleep. And if you want, I'll be here, whispering stories in your dreams, whenever you need me. Until next night.